paper was the color of old fat. I remember that. Creased and soft along the fold like it had been handled so many times it had gone to cloth. Horace Denny held it out toward me, the way a man holds out a dead bird he wants you to take off his hands. Arm extended, face turned a little away, like the thing shamed him but not enough to stop him. "You speak English clear enough," he said. "You understand what this is." I understood. I'd been understanding the white man's papers since before this one was born. His father's father had brought papers into the valley before the grass was broke. Papers about land, papers about treaty, papers about what the Lakota were permitted to do on the ground their grandfathers had bled for. I had held those too, read them, carried them a long time before I learned that papers meant nothing except what the men holding rifles decided they meant. This paper was a bill of sale. It had a girl's name on it, Nora Elise Croft, 15 years of age, given as surety against a whiskey debt by one Thomas Croft to one Horace Denny, who ran a trading post and a livery on the edge of our territory and called himself a fair man in both transactions. The debt was listed as $11.40. The paper was dated 3 weeks prior and had already made its way to me because Horace Denny had decided, in his calculation, that a Lakota war chief owed him something he could not otherwise collect. "You want her kept," he said. "I want the South Crossing. We can be agreeable men." The South Crossing was where my people forded the Chadron in spring. He wanted to build a toll bridge. Had wanted it 4 years running. I had told him 4 times that the crossing was not mine to give, that the water and the rock belonged to the Lakota people entire, and not to me alone, and that even if it were mine, I would not give it. He had smiled at me each time, like a man who has not yet reached the number he needs to hear. Now he had a girl. I did not take the paper from him. I looked at it in his hand. I looked at the name, Nora Elise Croft. The ink was lighter on the last name. Like the man writing it, had run dry and had to press harder to finish. "Where is she?" I said. He tipped his head toward the back of the trading post. There was a room there behind the dry goods where he stored flour and lamp oil. I had been in it once before, years back, settling a different kind of argument. It smelled of turpentine and mouse. I walked past him. He said something about the crossing, about being reasonable, about how a man in my position had to think about winter, about supply, about what the government agents would say if the trouble between us flared up again. I did not stop walking. She was sitting on a crate of salt bricks with her knees together and her hands in her lap. Small, even for 15, brown hair pulled back without much care. A bruise at her left jaw that was already going yellow, which meant it was a few days old at least. Dress was dirty at the hem, and she had boots on that were too big. Men's boots stuffed at the toe with something, newspaper maybe. She was looking at the floor when I came in, and when she looked up, her face went still in the way that very frightened people go still. I stood in the doorway and did not move toward her. I have learned, in 50 years of living among people who have cause to be afraid, first thing a man can give is stillness. No reach, no advance, just a body that is not coming at you. "Are you hurt?" I said. She shook her head. Then she looked at the bruise, as if she'd forgotten it, and shook her head again, in a way that meant, "Not further than this." I went back out to Horace Denny. He had been expecting a negotiation. His face was arranged for it. The particular set of a man who has positioned himself and is waiting to see what the other man will bid. I took the paper from him. He started to smile. I tore it, not in half. I tore it into pieces the size of my thumbnail, standing hint there in his trading post with the sun coming in through the one west window and falling, yellow on the puncheon floor, and I let the pieces fall. He went red, then white. He said something about law, about courts, about what he'd paid. I waited for him to finish. "There is no law," I said, "that makes a daughter surety for a father's whiskey bill. Not in Washington. Not in your God's book. Not in mine. She's all ready. The debt's all ready. I will not hear it." He was not a brave man. He was a man who had always relied on the weight of paper and the distance of consequence. Standing in front of me with his bill of sale in pieces on his floor, he had neither. He looked at the scraps. He looked at my face. He looked at the door. "I'll go to the agent," he said. "I'll tell them you took her." "Tell them," I said. "Tell them exactly how she came to be in your storeroom." He did not go to the agent. I rode back toward camp with the girl on a spare horse, mine leading hers. She didn't say anything for the first mile, neither did I. The sky was big and flat that day, the kind of autumn sky that makes the land look very old and very tired. And the grass had gone the color of a deer's flank, all that pale gold brown running to the horizon. I heard her horse blow through its nose. "I heard a meadowlark somewhere to the south," she said. "What are you going to do with me?" It was not quite a question. It was the thing she had been holding since the storeroom and had to set down. I said, "I am going to take you to my camp and see that you're fed. Then I will find out where your mother is, if you have one, or a grandmother, kin of some kind." She was quiet for a while. "My mother's in Ohio," she said. "She left when I was 9. Another silence. The horses walked. The grass moved. "I don't want to go back to my father," she said. "I know," I said. She looked at me then, and I felt it. Not a threat, and not the calculation of a frightened creature making a plan, but something younger and more honest. Just looking. Trying to read a face she had no grammar for. "My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I was given it by my father, who was given his by his father, fought in the time before the forts. I had been fighting the slow war, the paper war, the supply war, the winter war, for 20 years by then. I was 51 years old. I had buried a wife and a son. I had daughters grown and scattered. I had warriors who followed me, and traitors who feared me, and government men who spent their careers trying to find a way to diminish me, and failed. I was not a soft man, and I had no interest in becoming one. But I had also once, when I was very young, and my father was still alive to show me what a man could be, watched him pull a foal out of the mud of a spring flood and carry it half a mile on his back to dry ground, and then sit with it through the rest of that day and into the night until it stood on its own. He never spoke of it as a remarkable thing. It was simply what you did when something that could not to stand plained, needed someone to stand for it. I thought of that when I looked at the girl in the 2 big boots. I said, "You stay with my people until we find a proper arrangement. You will not be put to any labor you don't choose. You will not be touched by any man." I paused. "That includes me. I want to be plain about that." She looked at her horse's neck, nodded once. We rode into camp as the sun dropped below the ridgeline and the cooking fires started to show. Her name was Nora. She said it matter-of-factly on the second day, when one of the younger women, my cousin's wife, Winona, picked up English at the mission school and put it to her own uses. Asked her flat out what to call her. She said it the way people say their name when they have had to say it many times to strangers who would not remember it anyway. Nora. Like a stone dropped into water. Small sound, quick sink. She was not fragile. That became clear within a week. She had grown up on a frontier claim since she was 6, motherless since 9, and at the mercy of a man who valued whiskey above most things. She knew how to gut a rabbit and bank a fire. She knew how to carry water without being told. She was quiet in a way that was not softness, but a kind of learned economy. Don't use what you don't have to use. Don't spend what might be needed later. Winona liked her. That told me something. Winona was not a woman who suffered nonsense. I did not seek her out. I was not a man who had extra hours in a day. There was always something, a dispute about grazing, a meeting with the agency, a sickness moving through the horses. A young man who had done something stupid and needed talking to before he did something permanent. The camp had 300 souls in it, and most of their troubles found their way to my fire eventually. That was the life. Sometimes in the evenings she would be there, sitting a little outside the main fire. Sometimes with Winona, sometimes alone, and I would see her face in the light. She was not a pretty girl, in the way that word gets thrown around without thinking. She was something more specific than that. She had a good face, honest, a little hard around the eyes, like someone who has learned to see what's actually there rather than what they'd prefer. Once, about 3 weeks in, I came back from a night ride to find her awake, sitting outside my fire alone. Not because she'd been asked to wait, but because the camp dogs had gotten into something and woken everyone up. She'd gone out to settle them and stayed up. She had a blanket around her shoulders, and her hair was loose, and she looked at me with those clear eyes, said, "Coffee's still warm if you want it." I sat down, she poured it. We did not talk for a while. The dogs were quiet. The fire had burned to coals. She said, "Do you know why my father did what he did?" I said, "I have a guess. He didn't think of me as a person," she said. Not angry, just clear. He never did, really. I was something he had that he could use, like a wagon or a dog. She paused. "I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me." "I know," I said. "I'm saying it because I think you should know I understand what I was to him, so you don't have to try to protect me from understanding it." I looked at her, 51 years old, and here was a 15-year-old girl explaining herself to me, like we were two men talking straight across a fire. "You are not a wagon," I said. She almost smiled, almost the edge of something. "No," she said, "I know that." She went to bed. I sat with the coals a while longer. November came in hard. Early snow, which always meant more work and less of everything. The agency's supplies were late. They were always late. And every year, the quantities were less, and the explanations were more. And I spent most of that month in negotiation and horseback and argument. The girl was useful in ways I had not anticipated. She had taken over the fire banking for Winona's household, because she was good at it. And partly, I think, because having something regular to do kept her steady. She helped with the younger children when there was illness. She was not obtrusive about it. She just showed up where there was work and did it. A trader came through in December. White man out of Cheyenne, bringing blankets and tin goods, and a long stare at Nora that I clocked from 40 feet away. He asked Winona who the white girl was. Winona told him she was under my protection. He came and found me anyway, which told me something about his judgment. He was trying to be easy about it. Asked if I'd thought about the complications of having a white girl in camp, what the agency might say, what certain people in Cheyenne were already saying. I listened to him all the way through. He was not a stupid man, and he was making the case he thought would land. When he was done, I told him, "She is under my protection because I chose to extend it. Any man who troubles her troubles me. That includes men from Cheyenne." He left the next morning without incident. I thought about it that night, about what I had said and what it meant, and whether I had said it purely for her safety or for some other reason I wasn't fully looking at yet. I had been honest with her on that first ride. I wanted to be plain about that, I'd said, and I had kept to it. There was something happening in the quiet that I hadn't named. I was not going to name it yet. She was 15. The years go differently than you expect them to. She was 16 when she helped Winona birth a complicated baby that came out sideways, and she held Winona's hands for 11 hours and didn't leave. She was 17 when she started learning Lakota, not because anyone asked her to, because she was tired of having conversations happen around her. She was a quick study. She had an ear. Inside of a year, she could follow most of what was said. And inside of 2, she could hold a conversation if she was given a little time to find the words. She was 18 when her father turned up. He came with a man from the agency and a piece of paper of his own. This one with some kind of official seal on it. He had sobered up enough to look like a man who expected to be taken seriously. He stood outside the camp with the agency man and asked to speak to me. I walked out to them. Thomas Croft was a narrow man who had once been bigger, and you could see the ghost of the size he used to have in his frame had the structure of someone who had worked hard at some point in his life. His eyes were watery. He smelled of tobacco and something behind it that was trying to hide itself. He looked past me, toward the camp with the particular expression of a man who is calculating what he can demand and what he can get. He said he'd come for his daughter. Said she'd been held against her will. Said there were people in Laramie who were interested in the situation. The agency man shifted his feet and looked at his boots, which told me the agency man had not come here out of conviction. I said, "Is Nora here against her will?" Thomas Croft said that wasn't the point. I said, "That's the only point. I went and found Nora, told her flat. Father was here. Here was what he'd said. What did she want to do?" She stood still for a moment. She had her arms folded, and she was looking at the middle distance. Then she looked at me and said, "I want to stay." "Your father may make trouble," I said. "He's been making trouble my whole life," she said. "At least now I'm somewhere that trouble doesn't knock me down." I went back to Thomas Croft and I told him his daughter was staying by her own choosing, and that if he came here again with papers or without papers, he would need more than an agency man for company. I said it without raising my voice. The agency man wrote something in his little book, and then pocketed it, and they left before dark. That night she came and sat by my fire, and for a while neither of us talked. Winona had taken the children somewhere, and it was just the two of us and the fire and the sound of the camp at night all around. She said, "Thank you." I said, "You made your choice. I only made space for it." She shook her head slightly, like she was disagreeing with the way I'd put it. She didn't argue. She just sat there. After a while, she put her arm against my arm, just sat close and let our arms touch. She kept her eyes on the fire. A small thing, a plain thing. But she had chosen to do it, and I felt the weight of the choice. I did not move away. She was 20 when I asked her. Not the way a young man asks, full of heat and nerves. I was 56 by then. My joints told me every morning that I had lived hard, and I took the reminder without complaint. I was not a man who needed things soft anymore. I needed things true. We had been, I don't have a word for exactly what we had been, not kept apart by formality, together by anything that had been said. But there was a closeness that the whole camp had understood before I'd named it to myself. Winona had known for a year. She had said nothing to me, but she had said plenty with the way she arranged things, who sat where at a meal, how she managed to have somewhere to be when Nora and I were in the same place. I asked Nora in the evening, not far from the spot where I'd first sat down, and she'd handed me that cup of coffee. I told her I was old, and that she was young, and that I understood if the answer was no, and that nothing between us would change if it was. I told her I valued her, which was a small word for a large thing, but I have never been a man who performs what he could just say plainly. She looked at me for a long time, with those clear eyes that had never stopped seeing what was actually there. She said, "I've been your wife in every way that matters for 2 years. You're just making it formal." She said it without sentiment and without calculation. She said it the way she said her name, Nora, plain sound. "True, wait," I says, "is that a yes?" She said, "That's a yes." There is a thing that happens to a man when a good woman chooses him. Not a man who is young and doesn't know yet what choosing costs, but a man who is older and who knows exactly the weight of the decision and watches her make it anyway, with clear eyes. It is not the same feeling as being wanted. Being wanted is easy to come by if you are what I was. A man with standing and power and something to offer. That is commerce of a different kind. This was different. She had come to me broken-booted from a storeroom. She had grown up in my camp and learned my language and buried her grief about her mother and about the father who had put her on paper like a wagon, and she had done all of it with that particular economy of hers. No waste, no theater. And then she had looked at me, a 56-year-old Lakota chief, with heavy scars and a life behind him that would fill 10 lesser men, and she had said, "I've been your wife in every way that matters." There is nothing in this world that a man can earn or take that is worth as much as being chosen, freely. I knew that before. I know it more now. We were married in the Lakota way, and then, because she had asked and I had no objection, in. in the manner of the small Methodist church that had been built at the edge of the river town. The minister, there was a young man from Pennsylvania who looked at us with an expression I had seen before and would see again. That particular combination of discomfort and uncertain duty. And then he did what ministers are supposed to do when they are behaving rightly. He set his own comfort aside and he said the words. I respected him for that. The town had opinions. Towns always have opinions. There were men in Laramie who spoke about it in the way that men speak about things they are against, but can't quite make illegal. There were women who did not speak to Nora when she came to trade. There were government men who used it as a point of complaint against me in their ports to Washington, as if my marriage were an incident requiring documentation. I am still the man who controls the south crossing of the Chadron. Denny sold his trading post 3 years after I tore his paper and moved back to wherever he came from. Toll bridge he wanted was never built. The life after the wedding was not easy. No life is. We had years of thin supply and government hostility and the slow, grinding work of keeping a people whole when the world is arrayed against their wholeness. I was sick one winter, badly enough that there were men in camp who were making quiet calculations about what came next. Nora did not make those calculations. She stayed with me through the worst of it. Made me drink the awful things old Spotted Crane said would help, and then sat beside me through the nights when the fever was high, and I was not quite myself. Once, when I surfaced back to something like clarity in the gray before dawn, she was asleep, sitting up against the pole of our lodge, head dropped forward, her hands still in her lap. She hadn't left. When I was better, she didn't make a thing of it. Did not want me to feel bound by what she'd done. That was like her. She gave without wanting the debt. I told her anyway. I sat her down one morning when I was back on my feet and I said, I know what you did. I said it in Lakota because by then that was the language between us for things that mattered. She nodded. She said, I know you know. And that was enough. That is the texture of a good marriage, not the grand gesture. The small, plain, honest thing, said and received without flourish. I am 73 years old as I tell this. Nora is 37. In the evening she comes and sits with me, and we've watched the light go out of the sky over the valley. She has gray coming in at her temples now, just a little, and she doesn't care about it, which is a thing I love about her. She has the same clear eyes. She has more lines in her face. From sun, from weather, from 22 years of a hard life freely chosen. On bad days when my joints are bad and my temper is shorter than I'd like, she does not coddle me. She is straight with me, which is what I've always needed, and what most people have been unwilling to provide. My youngest daughter, from my first wife, who died of fever 30 years ago, came to visit last summer with her children. She and Nora sat for a long afternoon talking about, I'm not sure what. And when they came back to the fire, my daughter looked at me with an expression I had to work out the meaning of. It was not disapproval, it was something closer to relief. Like a weight set down, she said. She talks about you the way, and then stopped and tried again. She is very glad you tore that paper, I said. So am I. The fire was low that night. Most of the camp had gone to bed. Nora came and sat beside me, close the way she always sits, not leaning, just close enough that our arms touched. She was looking at the coals. The last of the summer was in the air. Some cricket somewhere, a horse moving in the dark beyond the lodges, she said, quietly, not to start a conversation, just because it was true. I would have found my way back to you, even if you hadn't come for me. I don't know how, but I would have. I put my hand on hers. She turned hers over and held it. The coals dimmed. The sky above the valley was full of stars, the way it gets in late summer, when the air dries out and there's nothing between you and everything above. We sat there a while. There was nothing that needed to be said, which is the sign you've found the right person. You run out of the need to prove things, and what's left is just the evening, and the stars, and the warmth of the hand that chose yours out of every hand it could have taken. That is the whole of it. That is all of what I have to tell you.